We're going to be looking at the Passion narrative tonight. Chapter 18 and chapter 19 are the Passion narrative in the Gospel of John. And what we'll find is that each Gospel has a slightly different version of the Passion narrative. There are definitely certain events that take place in all of the gospel accounts of the Passion, but there are other pieces of the Passion narrative that are very unique to John. We get in the Gospel of John here, we get these accounts of Jesus having a back and forth conversation with Pilate that is very different from the versions of the gospel in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so that raises the question: where did that discourse, where did that dialogue come from? If it was a private conversation between Pilate and Jesus, how did that get leaked? Where did that source come from? It's just a question that you have to ask yourself. But obviously the account of Jesus and Pilate was important to the gospel, to the community of John's gospel, and was really important to put it in there. The other thing is that I mentioned was that the Passion isn't that important to John as compared to other gospels. And I made the comparison to what we read in Mark last year. Only 1/10 of the Gospel of John is the Passion narrative. Whereas you compare that Gospel of Luke, or to the Gospel of Mark, and the Gospel of Mark is 1/3 of the Gospel of Mark is the Passion narrative. So Mark highly emphasizes the Passion, whereas John, it's very important, but it's not the be-all, end-all to the Gospel of John. And so when we look at chapter 18 and 19 here in a second, I think you'll find that to be the case. It doesn't have gravitas that some of the other gospels, have. It's a truncated version. We're missing the trial in front of Caiaphas, the chief priests. We're missing the trial in front of King Herod. It's a very streamlined gospel, which is very un-John. There's been nothing streamlined about John, right? There's nothing streamlined about John, but John is the least, he emphasizes the least of the four gospels, the Passion account. But yet at the end, it's still incredibly important. So, and I'm glad that we've reached this place. And then next week, we'll do chapter 20 and 21, and we'll finish the Gospel of John on time. So that's really good. So let's jump into it then, all right? So opening up to chapter 18, after the very long discourse and teaching that Jesus does with his disciples in private, that concludes Jesus's public ministry, or not only his public ministry, but also his private teachings with the disciples. And so chapter 18 begins is someone trying to get in the door? Do I keep hearing the door rattle?
I think so, maybe.
That rattle like that.
Okay, can someone just put eyes on the front door? Thanks. I just don't want to think that I missed somebody. So John begins the Passion narrative by having the disciples leave the house that they've been in, which is basically the upper room where they've been hanging out since they've reached Jerusalem this fifth and final time, and they head out to a place called the Kidron Valley, to a place where there was a garden. So John doesn't use the name Gethsemane, but that is exactly, he describes Gethsemane, but he doesn't say Gethsemane for some reason. But so the garden in the Kidron Valley is the Garden of Gethsemane. That's where we are. But for whatever reason, John doesn't just say. Yeah, he just doesn't say, and they headed out to the Garden of Gethsemane. But that is exactly where we're talking about. but in John's gospel, he, I think I've presented to you, and I still maintain that John is a really great writer and is very tight in his narrative, and he does these really great callbacks. And so the reason why Judas knows to take the temple police to the Garden of Gethsemane is because they've all been to Jerusalem 5 times now. And John points that out, that Judas knows this is where they like to hang out. So John, the gospel writer, presents that the Garden of Gethsemane is a regular hangout place for Jesus and his disciples whenever they come to Jerusalem. So Judas has the insight to say this is where we will meet them, and they come to this place, and a very important moment occurs. But what is missing? Those of you who know your passion,
I was thinking about this, the healing of the ear.
there is, okay, right?
Because he slices off the
Correct.
slave's ear and
Right.
he seals it.
But does he?
He just stops them from doing more.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I actually had to go back. And read the other gospel accounts and see, like, does Jesus heal the ear? I didn't find the healing of the ear in the other.
Stops them from killing. I
Yeah.
think he just.
But I'm with you. I thought Jesus healed the ear.
Yeah.
And so I was like, oh, maybe that's in Luke's gospel. So I went to Luke, and no ears chopped off in Luke's gospel.
Oh.
And then I went to Mark's gospel, and I was just like, oh, maybe it's in Mark's gospel. No, that's when we get the naked runner. Right? So we get a streaker in the gospel of Mark. But there's no ear cut off in the gospel of Mark. You get the streaker. So then you go to the Matthew gospel, and that's where the other account of the ear being chopped off is. And Jesus doesn't heal the ear there either.
Oh.
Yet, I can't tell you how I have in my head, Jesus heals that ear. And I want to say I've even preached that. And it's not there. So somehow, someway, the tradition.
I've seen it in a movie.
That's exactly right. I think you're exactly right. I think it's in the greatest story ever told. I think it's in the Passion of Christ. I think it's in like Jesus Christ Superstar. I think it's in all of them. Jesus heals the ear, but it's not biblical. It's
Passion writing, like they put all of the gospels together and made it one great story with
right.
that.
It could be, but I have this image in my head that Jesus heals the ear and he doesn't. But what else is missing? Anybody catch what else is missing in the arrest scenario?
The kiss.
Kiss, yes, Tim. Ding, ding, ding. There's no kiss. No. Oh, Judas, have you betrayed me with a kiss? He just steps forward. He doesn't even say anything. Jesus actually is the one who asks him, like, whom are you looking for? And they answer, Jesus of Nazareth. So chapter 18, verse 5, they answer Jesus of Nazareth, or Jesus the Nazarene, depending on your translation. But Jesus replied, who has Jesus saying what there? Chapter 18, verse 5. I am he over here. Anybody have anything else?
It says, I am he, but then it says below, the Greek phrase here, used here can also be rendered I am.
Yeah, there you go. Good. Thanks. A good footnote down there. I like it. So that's exactly right. So what we have here is a play on words that Jesus is evoking the name of God. So it's a double entendre. Who is who are you looking for? Jesus of Nazareth? I am me. But he's also saying the great name of God from the Exodus account at the burning bush when God reveals God's name to Moses. And so the very next scene the very next line, you have the temple priests, the temple police falling on the ground.
Mhm.
And so that is the natural reaction to what's called a theophany. When in biblical accounts, when someone is in the presence of God, then they often will fall on the ground and cover their eyes and protect themselves from God's glory, right? And so, so you have the temple police. So it's this really kind of interesting, ironic kind of thing going on where they're here to arrest Jesus. Jesus replies, "I am." They kind of, immediately kind of prostrate themselves and avert their eyes from Jesus, which is a great opportunity for Jesus to get away at that moment, but he doesn't. So he's, because he's into it. And so then, they ask him again, or he says, "Where is it again you're looking for?" And they say, "Jesus of Nazareth." And this time he said, "I told you I am." But they've come to their senses, and that's when they arrest him, or they bind him. And that's when Simon Peter draws the sword, strikes the ear of the high. And this time, and only in the Gospel of John, do we find out that the name of the person whose ear is cut off is Malchus. I don't know the other Gospels gives us those things, but Jesus tells Peter to put his sword away. And I think there are two different things going on here. One is, I think you're absolutely right. Jesus is kind of doing his nonviolence, like, listen, this is not basically saying, like, this is not our way, right? This is not what we're about. But also, it connects up later with the conversation with Pilate when Jesus says, "Listen, if my kingdom was of this world, my disciples would be fighting tooth and nail to keep me from being arrested." So it's also, connects up with that phrase that Jesus uses later.
Mr. Darryl, can I ask a question? I don't know where it falls in this, but, would Judas being paid with silver and stuff? What gospel is that mentioned in?
That's in the Synoptic Gospels.
Okay.
That's consistent through the three Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Okay.
But the 30 pieces of silver and everything, there's also not the death of Judas in the Gospel of John.
Okay.
And there's two different versions of the death of Judas, right? There's he hung himself on a tree, and the other is he flung himself off a cliff. And so there's also disagreement about how he died. So two Gospels report Judas's death, and two Gospels don't. But the two Gospels that do, which I think are Matthew and Luke, don't say he did it in the same way.
Okay.
Yeah. Judas doesn't have as big of a role in the Gospel of John as he does in the other Gospels. So then we get Jesus taken to the home of the high priest. And you might get confused because then they say, well, we'll take him to the high priest Caiaphas. So Annas is Caiaphas's father-in-law. So Caiaphas is married to Annas' daughter. Annas was high priest from the year 6 to the year 15 AD or CE. And then Caiaphas took over as high priest, has been the high priest for the last 15 years or so. And what's interesting is Caiaphas's time as high priest comes to a close, if I remember right, about the year 35, and Annas takes over from being high priest again. I used to compare it to, I don't think it's this bad, but it's kind of like, to me, it reminded me of when like Putin stepped down from being president of Russia to become prime minister, only to become president again. That's kind of what is happening here, is Annas steps back from being quote unquote the high priest, but you kind of get the sense that he's kind of a co-high priest with Caiaphas, and that the two of them just kind of went back and forth for a couple of decades of trading off who was high priest. And so Annas is a big deal. Annas is a big deal. And
it was kind of a convoluted paragraph too, when I was reading. I thought, well, now who's exactly doing, who's in charge here?
Yeah. So technically Caiaphas is the chief priest, and Annas is the high priest, but that would be kind of like being president, vice president. But they just kind of kept flipping roles, Pam, that's really good. And you also get a reappearance for the first time since chapter 13 of the other disciple. And so you start to really pick up the rivalry between Peter and the other disciple. And the first, little incident of like the other disciple is he's got an inside connection to the temple and to the high priest. And so he gets entry into the courtyard. But then you get the very, like I said, some of the past narratives are the same, and you have pieces that are connected throughout the different the Gospels, and you get the narrative of Peter's denial of Jesus, and it's broken up over two parts. You get Jesus's arrest. Peter and the other disciple enter the courtyard. The first time Peter is asked, is he one of Jesus' disciples? He says no. Then we come back to the conversation between Jesus and Annas. And then after that, you get the second and third denial. But what you don't get in the Gospel of John is Peter's reaction to you get that highly emotional Peter in the Synoptic Gospels, that he realizes what he's done and he weeps. You don't get that in John's Gospel. Peter doesn't really seem to have an emotional, it almost doesn't, if you just were reading the Gospel of John and you didn't have that other image of Peter's lament of recognizing what he had just done, you would almost skip the sense that Peter doesn't even realize what he's done. Right. And that he doesn't even remember what Jesus told him literally hours ago. I know this seems like a lot, like, because this has been a couple of weeks since you actually have like read Jesus's prediction of Peter's denial, but in the timeline, we're talking about hours have gone by since Jesus said to Peter, "And you will deny me 3 times." And yet we have here in terms of the Peter not even seeming to have a reaction. But what we do get is, like I said, a very unique to John is 2 different conversations that are not recorded anywhere else. And we get details of the punishment that Jesus takes during the Passion narrative that we don't get in anywhere else, including that Annas seems to have in his employ Luca Brasi from The Godfather, because Luca Brasi didn't like the way that Jesus communicated with Annas, and he comes up and he slugs him in the face, and which just reminded me of every good mafia movie I've ever seen. Like, you don't talk to the Don the right way, then the muscle's going to come and pop you in the nose. And that's as good as it's ever going to, that's as good as it's going to get. And it's never going to get that good again. And I just kept thinking of that the whole time. And I don't remember that happening in any of the other Gospels, the account of like the heavy in the room coming up and popping Jesus in the face. So all those times that Jesus was the ninja earlier in the Gospel, that has all come to an end. And now he really does take it on, and he does take quite a pounding here. But Jesus's point is, I've done nothing secret. Like, and you've had all these opportunities to, like, so he keeps putting it back on them that he finds it very ironic that they're acting now at all times. But we also have this fulfillment of the prediction of Caiaphas, that it's better for one man to die than for lots of people to die. So then we have Jesus coming back he gets taken to Caiaphas, but unlike the other Gospels, which actually record the conversation between Caiaphas and Jesus, they go straight to Pilate. And it's these Pilate conversations that are incredibly unique to the Gospel of John, and paint two different pictures that are very important. One is the reluctance of Pilate So, we talk about Passion of Christ, and we talk about the greatest story ever told, or Jesus Christ Superstar and everything. And a lot of times that betrayal of Pilate is of the reluctant judge, and he really doesn't want to do this. A lot of that characterization comes from this gospel. It's this portrait of Pilate that then gets picked up by, the great filmmakers and the great,
So where does the characterization of his wife come in? Is she mentioned in?
She's in the other one. I have to look up which one she's in, but she's in the one.
Does she have a dream or?
She does.
Yeah.
Yeah, she does. Yeah, and that's in a different gospel. I'd have to look what one that's out though. The other thing that you also get is, whereas Pilate's role is presented differently in that he's this reluctant judge. He seems very sympathetic to Jesus's plight. He seems to resonate with many of his answers. We also get the downplaying of the crowds. And the Gospel of John, it's not the crowds who shout, "Crucify him." It is the Jewish religious authorities. And John presents a very clear case that it's not the turning of the people on Jesus. It's not the crowds that were at Palm Sunday shouting Hosanna, Hosanna that turn on Jesus. This is an attempt by religious authorities who are threatened by Jesus to use their power to get rid of the problem. And the crowds are not anywhere near this. John is very clear that it's the religious authorities, it's the temple priests, it's the temple police who are manipulating Pilate and who are really escalating the situation very, very quickly. There's none like the crowds. There's no such thing as the crowds in the Gospel of John, which actually is probably more historically accurate. Because one thing that we do know about Pilate's palace in Jerusalem is the courtyard was incredibly small. And so you probably could only get a couple of dozen people in the courtyard anyway. So this idea of the crowds swarming on Pilate's, palace, they wouldn't have been able to enter anyway. So this is probably the more historically accurate version of it in terms of keeping into account what Pilate's situation is in terms of his living quarters. But I want to just dive into this real quick. So chapter 18, verse 33. Oh, one more thing. There's also another wonderful piece of irony why the Jews don't enter into the house of Pilate. And there's two reasons. John presents it because they don't want to defile themselves because the Passover ritual. So why would Jews be defiled by entering a Gentile home? Any guesses? I think there's the obvious, and then there's the more subtle. What?
That you heard animal or
it probably had nothing to do with, it would be dietary. It would be totally dietary, that they could enter into a non-Jewish home and they could touch leavened bread, or they could touch, they could touch meat that wasn't kosher, and everything. And then they'd have to go through all of this like ritualistic purification rites to be able to partake in the Passover ritual. And the Passover is about to begin, and they have a lot to do. They have hundreds of lambs that they have to slaughter. The families are bringing their lamb to the temple for it to be ritualistically slaughtered, so it can be handed back to the family, so it can be used during the Passover, their own family Passover. And so, but those lambs have to be ritualistically slaughtered in a very specific way at the temple for it to be used at Passover. So they can't get COVID. They got a high holiday that they gotta do. I mean, that's what I told the doctor on Monday when I got my antibiotic. I was like, even if you don't think I have a sinus infection now, please just give me the antibiotic because I can't be sick. This is a really important time of year. that's basically what they're doing. They're protecting themselves because they know they have a role to play. Regardless of what's going on with Jesus, they have this other thing going on called Passover, which is really important. The other one is, I think the more slight irony of it is that they're trying to kill Jesus, and nothing defiles you quicker than touching a dead person.
Yeah.
And so there's this idea that Jesus is dead man walking, and they don't want to be anywhere near that to become defiled. But I want to look really closely to, because I think this is a really important discourse between Pilate and John, and it informs early Christianity. So Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "Did you come to that conclusion on your own, or did someone tell you that?" And Pilate says, "Listen, man, I'm not. This isn't my fight. And so what have you done to get here?" And Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." And this seems to placate Pilate, that Pilate does not sense that Jesus is a political threat to Rome. And Jesus says, but Pilate says, "So you are a king then?" And Jesus says, for this I was born, and I came into this world to testify to the truth, and everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." And then Pilate asks him, "What is the truth?" What is the truth?
He is the truth.
He is the truth. He told us that a few chapters ago, right? "I am the way, the truth, and the light." And so Jesus isn't concerned with himself being a king. He's concerned with being the way, the truth, and the light of the light, the word that became flesh. Those are all the things that Jesus seemed, and John, that Jesus is concerned with. And and Jesus doesn't answer John or Pilate in the Gospel of John. And so we just kind of get this hanging question out there. But it's a really, really fascinating thing. One of the things that early Christianity did, in contrast to Judaism, was, even though Christians were persecuted by Rome, the early church took great care not to instigate and not poke the Roman bear. And there was consistent and constant maneuvering by early church leaders to remind Rome that Jesus said to Pilate in the Gospel of John, "Our kingdom is not of this world," to sort of help lessen the persecution. Judaism poked the Roman bear to the place where at Manasseh in the year 70, hundreds of Jews are slaughtered by Roman legions, and the Second Temple is destroyed again in Jerusalem in the year 70. And so if you don't know the story of the slaughter, the massacre at Manasseh, you can, Wikipedia it. But Judaism poked the Roman bear one too many times, and Rome just said, "Okay, we're done with this." Christianity at that point just very much tried not to get into Rome's face. They still ended up doing so, but the early church leaders really tried not to instigate Rome, and eventually even opened themselves up to taking in Romans into the early church. So last but certainly not least, I just want to tell you that Barabbas on chapter 18, verse 40, they do, the whole "give us Barabbas" thing. That's in all four of the gospel accounts. But John has a really bad word here for Barabbas. He says that now Barabbas was a bandit. Does anyone else have anything else besides bandit? You could have thief. Robber, right. That's not what Barabbas was. Barabbas was a terrorist. That is honestly, that's the best way I can put it. is he was a zealot and and in modern terms, we would consider him a terrorist. He's the type of person who, he was in jail for a good reason, and it wasn't for petty theft. The other gospels paint a much different picture, that he's a much more violent individual. And so again, we have, it's not only does Pilate not seem to be too convinced of Jesus's guilt, but then on top of it, we get a doubling down on the innocence of Jesus by this incredibly violent criminal being released back into the public. So that's the first half of the Passion narrative. So then we move on to chapter 19, and we get Jesus. So basically, Pilate's hands are tied at this point, and so I know this sounds incredibly violent and horrific, and it is. But Pilate's flogging of Jesus is actually, in many ways, Pilate, from John's perspective, Pilate trying to save Jesus's life, because flogging was the most typical punishment for was the most typical Roman punishment for breaking the law. To be crucified was an extreme punishment. This was the lesser of the two. And if you read Paul's account in the second letter to the Corinthians, he talks about how many times he's been flogged, and then other accounts from Josephus and Philo and others give similar accounts that flogging was the most typical, but it was basically trying to save his life at this point. And of course you get this mockery of him. So you have Pilate on one hand, who's trying to, you see, gets the sense, like, again, that reluctant judge, I really don't want to have to pass judgment on this dude. But then you get his people who, they're like, all right, well, we'll mock him. And so they do the crown of thorns, they put the purple robe, all those things. And again, you get down to, and you get another Pilate saying, listen, I find nothing against him. But the chapter 6 or verse 6 of chapter 19, when the chief priests and the police saw Jesus, they shouted, crucify him, crucify him. In the other gospel accounts, and the crowd shouted. But in John, it's very clear who's leading the charge here. Again, Pilate tries to get out from underneath them. The Jews, in chapter 19, verse 7, the Jews answered him saying, we have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he's claimed to be the Son of God. Crucifixion, though, was not a Jewish way of delivering a death penalty. It would have been death by stoning. Still, yeah, which sounds as horrific to me. I mean, that just sounds awful.
That really does sound awful.
But their law, the law that they're referring to is the law against blasphemy, but the punishment for such blasphemy was stoning. But again, to stone someone this close to the Passover would have completely defiled them and made them ritualistically unclean. So they could not carry out the judgment. And so they're asking Pilate. And then Pilate, it says here, Pilate was more afraid now than ever. And that one verse, chapter 19, verse 8, he was more afraid than ever. There are volumes of historic commentaries asking the question, why did Pilate go from being a reluctant judge to being a fearful, afraid judge? And there's lots and lots of literature out there about that. from this could be Pilate's. This could be a moment of Pilate's. There's one set of commentaries talking about this could be a moment of Pilate's conversion. That this is the moment where he starts to believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and now he recognizes his culpability in this plot. There are others that say that it's because Pilate is fearful that if he doesn't follow through, that there could be a riot, that things could get out of control. There's lots of different theories, and your theory is as good as anybody else's because it doesn't tell us why he's afraid. It just says that he gets afraid.
Well, he was afraid of how he was gonna be presented in history.
Yeah, right. There's that too. Sure. And God knows he's been presented. Yeah, right. And so there is actually, I'll have to look this up. He is a saint in one branch of Christianity.
Really?
He is considered it's not Catholicism or Orthodoxy, but I'd have to look it up. But he has been sanctified. Thanks. Yeah, he's been sanctified by one of the branches of the Christian tradition. I'd have to look up to see where he is.
I never pictured him as a villain.
Well, right.
I think he was in the wrong place.
He was the pawn of something that he's doing. Honestly.
So that is the pop culture version of Pilate.
Okay.
That is not the historical record of Pilate.
Yeah.
Get through the Bible if you don't have a Jewish education. Because it's missing, you're missing all of their traditions and lies. And we're
That's a good word, I think.
interpreting them
Yes.
differently.
That's exactly right.
I think we ought to read the book of Judas as well.
Well, I'll be happy. We can read the gospel according to Judas. There we go.
It does exist.
But the historical record of Pilate is he was much more tyrannical than the gospel version of Pilate. And again, I would attest that part of that is an appeasement to Rome to say, please don't come after us.
We did our job.
And because remember, John, the Gospel of John is written about 20 years after the massacre of Manasseh and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. They've seen the power of Rome. And so to present a Pilate that is a more sympathetic figure could be a way of keeping Rome off of them. But let's move on. So you get one more private conversation between Pilate and Jesus. And Jesus, and here you have Jesus who basically absolves Pilate of some of his guilt. And then Pilate tries one more time to release him. And then Pilate, I think at this point, because Pilate realizes that, according to the way that John presents the trial, Pilate recognizes that he's not going to be able to release Jesus and that he's going to have to pass judgment. But before he passes judgment, he does this is real politique. Like, oh man, I read this and I was just like, this is Game of Thrones, good stuff. He recognizes he's going to have to do what he doesn't want to do, but he's still going to get something out of this. And what he gets out of this is one more oath of allegiance from the Jewish high priests that they are in his back pocket. And now he has a political chip to play the next time he needs them to do something for him. And there's a piece of me just because, I read The Godfather and I've watched Game of Thrones and all this stuff, and I'm just like, that's good politics. I mean, honestly, having taught political science on the college level for a few years, I recognize a deal when I see one, and so we hear it. So finally, he hands him over to be crucified. And so it's not until chapter 19, verse 16, that Pilate finally renders judgment, and we see Jesus moving on to be crucified. So then a lot of what's next are things that I think, are in other gospels. They're part of our understanding of the crucifixion event, the writing of the names, the writing of the inscription, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, the Jewish authorities coming back, please don't write that. But Pilate, he's had enough of them, and he sticks with it. The dividing of the clothing, but you may not know. Does anyone have the footnote that says where that prophecy that they divided my clothes among themselves, and my clothing for my clothing they passed along? Anyone know where that quote comes from? Anybody got a footnote?
Psalm 22.
Yeah, Psalm 22. Sherry, where what's also part of Psalm 22?
Well, in 22:18, I think it talks about the soldiers doing a lot, and then there's a couple other things too. When David cries out, why have they done this to me, or something? I don't have it verbatim, but
yeah. No, you got it. It's my God, why have you forsaken me? Right?
Yeah.
So that's the very famous first line of the Psalm 22. And of course, that's what Jesus cries out in the Synoptic Gospels, right? But John doesn't have Jesus crying, my God, why have you forsaken me? But he does have an allusion to Psalm 22 in his gospel, and it's this part of Psalm 22. I mentioned a few weeks ago that for the early Christian church, the prophecy of Isaiah, particularly the prophecy of Isaiah and the Psalms, were incredibly important to the early Christian movement to find evidence of Jesus's messiahship in the Old Testament. And the prophecy of Isaiah and the Psalms were the two places that the early Christian church read Jesus into those scripture verses. And so Psalm 22 was a very important psalm to the early church, because the early church read that psalm and immediately connected it to Jesus's crucifixion. So even though John doesn't have Jesus saying the most famous verse of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? John does have an allusion to that very important psalm to early Christianity in this line from about the clothes. So then we get an event that only takes place in the Gospel of John. And it's unique for two reasons. One, verse 19, verse 25. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother, his aunt, and Mary Magdalene.
They're all named Mary.
They're all named Mary, right? This is why the Marys get very confusing. Yeah, that's when they get very confusing, all the Marys. So it's unique in one way, in that in the other Gospels, the women stand at the distance.
Is this the first time they mentioned Mary Magdalene in John?
Oh, is this the first? No, we've met Magdalene before now. I think so.
It was implied, but it didn't say.
Yeah. Did we not meet Magdalene before now? I thought we had, but maybe not. I'd have to go back and look.
Cause I thought it was somewhere in there.
Yeah.
That it was like, we inferred that it was Magdalene.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily.
Right. Might be the first time she's been mentioned, though. You're right. You might be right. She becomes a very important figure in chapter 20, though. So they're there, but they're very close. They're standing near the cross. In the Synoptic Gospels, they present them as being far away, observers, but standing far away. And then Jesus gives the disciple whom he loved, it says, take care of my mom, and that's what happens there. And so again, you have this, you have the Gospel of John presenting this other disciple as having this very special relationship with Jesus. And then he has given the responsibility of taking care of his mother. The reason why, if in Jewish, first century Jewish tradition, if we assume Joseph is dead by this point, he's shown up nowhere, right? Yeah, so we assume Joseph is dead at this point, and the tradition has Joseph dying in Jesus's teenage years, though we have no record of that, but that's the tradition. If Joseph is dead, then the responsibility of the care of Mary falls on their firstborn, which would be Jesus. Now, we can make an argument that Jesus has not been fulfilling that responsibility through the Gospel of John, but technically it was his responsibility to take care of his mother. Now, with the firstborn son dead, then technically Mary's livelihood would come into question, and she potentially could end up being a beggar. Her situation in life could become precarious. And so by saying to the beloved disciple and to Mary, you two are now family, then in many ways, it's an act of Jesus to take care of Mary, to make sure that his mother is taken care of, because he is no longer going to be able to do that. Again, you could say he hasn't necessarily been that good at it to begin with to this point, but that's only from one point of view. He didn't want to stay on the farm, so that's all right. But
No, as a mother, the mother said, I understand you have a job to do.
yeah, right.
Can be able to take care of her.
So
Yeah.
I mean, she.
you allow them to do that.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, see, a man doesn't,
That doesn't, and not a parent, right? I mean, that's, I always like to say things like, I'm not a parent here, but I was the son who left at 18 and never came back, so.
Okay.
I mean, Christmas and Thanksgiving, but I never went back, so,
This was Passover.
right.
Okay.
So then,
Is there a reason that it's always just the disciple? Because is there a reason why there's no name?
so you're right. So so the tradition says that it's actually it's actually John, right? That's who the tradition says. I'd have to look up some more as to
I'm just
why,
curious. It's always like.
I do know the standard answer to that is it's to present this alternative to Peter. And
It's just not Peter.
it's just not Peter, right? Basically. So let's go on to a couple of things, because there's also a few more things I want to make sure we point out. So you actually get for the first time in the Gospel of John, you actually have Jesus consuming food or drink, and it's on the cross. Even though he's been invited to feasts, and was at a wedding banquet, there's actually no line that says, and Jesus consumed some of the water from some of the wine that he turned from water. This is the first time we ever actually see Jesus drinking anything. And you may be might not be aware that a hyssop is the traditional sponge that is used to put the blood of the lamb on the doorpost at the Passover. So this is another connection of Jesus as the Paschal Lamb for Passover, the sacrifice for for the world on the cross. So it's that other connection. But then we have Jesus's last words in the Gospel of John is not my God, why have you forsaken me? But it is finished. You also have none of the supernatural events in the Gospel of John at the crucifixion that you have in the other Gospels. There's no tearing of the temple curtain. There's no eclipse. There's no zombies. And that's a thing. If you don't know, in the Gospel of Matthew, zombies invade Jerusalem when Jesus is crucified. So there's no supernatural events. John just presents it as this death. The meaning of the death comes afterwards, and there's no supernatural things. Chapter 19, 31 through 37, it gives you actually a pretty good historical account of Roman crucifixion. In that after a period of time, Rome would go and break the legs of a crucified person who was being crucified to hasten the death. And one of the ways in which they would make sure that a person was dead was they would stab them with a spear. And yeah, right. And so we do get a historical accurate account of how brutal it is. But again, that picture of Jesus as the Paschal Lamb, the Paschal Lamb has to be perfect. It's no blemishes. And so they don't break Jesus's legs. Therefore, he is unblemished. But he does have the spear, which becomes very important in chapter 20 when we have the Thomas account. And then lastly, we get an appearance by Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. So these are two very influential and powerful figures. Joseph of Arimathea was a wealthy Jewish entrepreneur and had a great deal of prestige in the Jewish community. And it says that he was a secret disciple in the Gospel of John. And then we have Nicodemus, who was a member of the Sanhedrin, was a Pharisee, and so also someone of some renown. And so they're the ones who take Jesus and bury him according to Jewish custom. And they do it all before the Passover begins. So no one is breaking Jewish law, though Nicodemus and Joseph would have to do, by touching the body, they would have to do some ritual cleansing before they could participate in Passover. And you may or may not know that cemeteries weren't called cemeteries in the ancient world. They were called gardens. And so when they say they placed them in the garden, that's just a word for a cemetery. And you may or may not know that if a church has a cemetery connected to its property, the cemetery on the church property is not called a cemetery. It's called a garden. And so they lay these two gentlemen. And so the other thing that's missing, though it's inferred because it's one of the first things they talk about in this next chapter, is that there's no stone rolled in front. It happens obviously because chapter 20 begins with them talking about how Magdalene seeing that the stone had been removed. but John actually doesn't say they put a stone in front of it, whereas the other gospels are very clear. There's this massive stone in front of the, but again, there's none of that. So we made our way through the Passion in 50 minutes, because the first 10 minutes I was muting. So we had to start all over again. Any questions, any comments? I ran through that pretty quick, but I'm trying to keep us on track. So anything about that you didn't know or have a question about, Tim?
Oh, very interesting, but I wanted to go back to chapter 18. I
Okay.
think verse 31,
Yep.
back and forth with Pilate, who's gonna kill Jesus? The Jews or the Romans?
Yeah.
The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put any man to death." And I thought, that doesn't sound right. As you were saying, there is a Jewish way of execution, it's stoning him. And I think you're saying it seemed inappropriate maybe for that time during their celebration. Is
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's what you're talking. I think that's exactly right, Tim. They have a law against blasphemy, which would, constitute a stoning if found guilty of blasphemy. But because of the day of preparation for the Passover, they could not participate in an execution on that day. So their hands were tied in terms of doing this themselves.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Well, the other one I highlight seemed to be the gotcha, not for you, but for the gospel writer of John. 19 verse 7, and you pointed that one out already specifically, saying that he does deserve death because he called himself the Son of God.
Right.
So it just kind of seemed like a bookend to me that didn't quite meet, but
sure.
I think you explained it pretty well.
Okay, good. I'm glad you. Yeah, I'm glad when I do that, Tim. Thanks.
Yeah.
I like that better than when I don't. So, any other questions or comments or?
The only thing I would say is it's probably been done. Someone has taken like John and wrote all the Jewish customs or explained them. Is there one?
Can I, yes, can I, so this is one of my resources that I use every week. It is the New Testament that has been scoured over by amazing scholars who are Jewish, and there are massive amount of footnotes of just saying, where this comes from or something. Yes, and I think it's invaluable. It's invaluable to sort of understand.
Well, I'm reading it and I have one concept and then you throw something entirely different out and I'm going, whoa.
Well, and that's why I like to call it Bible study. I mean, I know I've said this a number of times, is Bible study. We can also sit down together, Eileen, and read the scripture verse and just get spiritual meaning out of it, and I'm okay with that too.
Okay.
But that's why I call this Bible study and not Bible devotion or something like that, right? So, though I hope that it's also been spiritually uplifting for you as well, and not just a history class. I do hope it's been somewhat.
It's been both.
Good. That's the goal, is for it to be both. So, all right, everybody. I would invite us to close out tonight with our Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen. Thanks, everybody. Be well.